Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, new information regarding the motive for killing Esther Horgan in a terror attack last month now coming to light. Meanwhile, Israel calling on the international community to band together against Iran's latest threats. And finally, the Israel Antiquities Authority reporting a historic discovery with global implications. We begin tonight with breaking news of an attempted terror attack in the Gush Etzion junction. A Palestinian suspect armed with a knife refusing repeated calls to stop as he approached a group of soldiers opposite a gas station. Israeli forces reportedly then opened fire into the air, but when the attacker continued, even throwing his knife towards the soldiers, they retrained their aim and neutralized the attacker. And another terror-related news, we now have an update in the tragic terrorist murder of Israeli mother Esther Horgan, who was violently killed 3 weeks ago while out for a jog near her home in Judea and Samaria. Newly unveiled information by the Shin Bet security services now pointing to a motive for the senseless killing, as well as additional details about the terror attack itself. During interrogation, the 40-year-old Palestinian suspect reportedly revealing that he was motivated to revenge over the death of Palestinian security prisoner Kamal Abu Wail, who was the first such prisoner in Israel to get COVID-19 and then later die from the disease. And the suspect in Horgan's murder, having himself been a former fellow inmate of Abu Wail's, jailed multiple times in Israel for terror offenses. Meanwhile, as for the details of the attack itself, the suspect went on to admit that on the afternoon of December 20th, he saw Horgan walking alone through the forest where he was smuggling cigarettes through the security fence, deciding then to approach her and strike her fatally in the head with a rock. 4 other suspects have since been arrested on suspicion of helping the suspect evade justice. Moving on, the pandemic growing exponentially by the day. Israel, for one, now reporting its highest daily infection rate in months. Yet, despite the setbacks, the light at the end of the tunnel seemingly still getting a little bit closer, as nearly 1.4 million Israelis have now been vaccinated.
מיליוני החיסונים שאנחנו הבאנו לארץ הציבו את ישראל במקום הראשון בעולם ליציאה מהקורונה. אני עושה הכל כדי שנוכל להמשיך לחסן בקצב המהיר הזה. במקביל אני אכנס את הממשלה ב-48 השעות הקרובות כדי לקבל החלטה על הידוק הסגר במאמץ אחרון למיגור המגפה. בזכות מיליוני החיסונים וסגר קצר ומהודק אנחנו נציל חיים רבים ונהיה הראשונים בעולם לפתוח את הכלכלה.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reassuring the nation ahead of this week's cabinet meeting that Israel is in fact on a clear path towards recovery. And new lockdown measures meant to keep us on the path, potentially now including a strict 10-day closure across the country, though Defense Minister Benny Gantz is opposing at least the total shutdown of the school system. But this, as the exponentially rising number of infected, is terrifying Israeli authorities. Overnight infections in Israel rising by over 8,300, the highest daily rise since September, and bringing the total active number of cases to 56,223. The death toll likewise climbing by an average of 25 per day, the new total now at 3,448.
התחלואה הזאת שעולה, אנחנו רואים אותה, היא מעמיסה על מערכת הבריאות, מעמיסה על בתי החולים ועל קופות החולים. נכון, אנחנו לא בקריסה של מערכת הבריאות, אבל התחלואה הקשה הזאת גורמת לעומסים בבתי החולים, עומסים על הצוותים ועל קופות החולים, מה שבהחלט יכול להביא בסופו של דבר לפגיעה בטיפול השוטף, בתחלואה השוטפת, ואנחנו בהחלט לא רוצים להגיע לשם.
Health Minister Yuli Edelstein similarly saying that if we don't take the most stringent actions, then by March we'll be in the same situation as Italy was last March. Italy being among the worst affected countries by the pandemic, now counting over 75,000 deaths by coronavirus to date.
אני מזכיר לכם רק מספר אחד. הממשלה קיבלה את ההחלטה על הסגר, מה שאצלנו נקרא סגר ימי תשרי, כשהיינו עם 2,900 מאומתים ליום. אנחנו היום ספרנו יותר מ8,000 מאומתים, ועוד לא התקבלה שום החלטת ממשלה.
That said, Israel's vaccination drive is still running strong. Over 1.37 million Israelis having now received their first dose of the Pfizer vaccine. And while the first shipment of vaccinations is beginning to dwindle, Israeli authorities are hard at work in negotiations with Pfizer to advance their next shipment from February to sometime this month, especially as both Pfizer and Edelstein point out that the vaccine is only effective 1 week after the second and final dose. Finally, though, in additional efforts to keep the positive momentum going, the Health Ministry has now approved of the Moderna vaccine and will begin importing 6 million doses for 3 million people this month. The Moderna vaccine likewise manipulating RNA protein receptors and requiring 2 separate doses to be effective. And joining us now for more on the alarming statements coming from the Israeli health authorities is Professor Manfred Green, Director of the Masters in Public Health Program at the University of Haifa. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor. Now, first off, what is the difference between the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine?
Okay, I'm going to say something I don't usually do. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm a physician epidemiologist, and I've had a long-term experience in testing vaccines. And I say this because I see so many people being interviewed who don't really have expertise. But let's go on. You want basically for me to tell you something about the difference between the two vaccines?
Yes, I do, because I understand that they both work on RNA.
Right, they're essentially the same technology, mRNA, slightly different, what you would say, slightly different platform, but essentially the same technology, the same concept.
So do you, what do you think about Deputy Director General Professor Itamar Grato's support for nixing the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine, at least? Does that alarm you?
Generally speaking, we prefer not to mix, but there's not necessarily a very sound reason for not mixing. It depends on the circumstances. If the technology is the same, then it shouldn't really have any real impact. There may be slight differences basically in terms of the formulation, the dosage and so on, but by and large, it's not usually a problem.
But aside from mixing these two different vaccines for the 2 doses, there's been a lot of argument that maybe we can make do with just 1 dose instead of 2 of either. Does that alarm you in any way?
It alarms me not because it's impossible, but because of the way the decisions are being taken. Let me make a few comments and try not to be too critical. What happened in the UK was that they saw this large increase in cases and felt, I guess, that they were to some extent losing control of the situation. And the decision to delay the second dose, because I think they've not just gone over to 1 dose, but to delay it, I think was taken fairly hastily. Basically, when a vaccine is produced and it goes through the phase trials, phase 1, phase 2, and so on, there is a dosing schedule that's tested. In other words, the companies actually test which is the best dose and which is the best combination. So when you deviate from that, you're really going into virtually another trial. You're not actually, you're not actually using it the way it was tested. So that could be a problem. And maybe I'll just add a couple of points on that. Yeah, I think the idea in the UK, as I understand it, is to delay the second dose to 3 months later. And there's several problems with that. One is that you may not have enough immunity from the first dose, and you may lose that in that 3-month period. The second is that many people may not come for the second dose because it's stretched out. And the third is that we really don't know to what extent that'll affect long-term immunity. So
what proof do we have really for either the vaccine or either the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccines? What proof do we have for its longevity in any case?
We don't. Well, clearly it's a new vaccine, and we don't have really a great deal of information about the real long term. We now have several months, basically, maybe a little bit more from the trial, and it'll take us time. So we really have to go on the basis of 2 things: on the biology, in other words, what kind of antibodies are produced, and the sort of the lab stuff. And the other is to compare it basically with other vaccines, which may be using a different technology, but essentially the idea is to induce antibodies. So it does seem to us that it'll have, if the virus doesn't change substantially, it could, if you have the 2 doses, you could have long-term immunity. But again, if you ask me whether we have data on that, obviously we don't, because it hasn't been used for that long.
All right, Professor Green, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Now, in the meantime, as Israeli officials try to maintain the health of the population, a new financial plan to aid businesses struggling to survive the pandemic has been unveiled.
אני מביא היום עם שר האוצר הצעה לתת מענקים נוספים לעצמאים ולבעלי עסקים בהיקף של למעלה מ2 מיליארד שקלים. זה עוד אלפי שקלים לכל בעל עסק שנפגע בתקופת הקורונה, ובנוסף אנחנו גם מעריכים את תקופת ההחזר של הארנונה. הכסף הזה יקל מיידית על העסקים, ותוך זמן קצר נפתח את כל המשק ונצא סופית מהמשבר.
So what's the latest? Well, first is a property tax refund that'll be given to businesses suffering over 400 million shekels in losses. Then apart from that, the main points in the plan include an extension into January and February of the eligibility period for applying for grants to assist in regular business expenses. Meanwhile, additional grants will be given on a sliding scale to businesses reporting losses of at least 25% compared to turnovers in 2019. The sliding scale being 3,000 shekel grants for losses of up to 40%, 5,000 shekels for losses up to 60%, and up to 9,000 shekels for losses of 60% and higher. That said, there will also be a grant ceiling determined according to the depth of the business's loss, and the ceiling being up to 50,000 shekels for the larger companies. All right, moving now back to election season. The campaign trail is off to a very eventful start, with several new alliances and declarations publicized over the past couple of weeks. And with us to discuss is Chief Political Correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, Gil Hoffman. Gil, thanks so much for being with us. Now, let's start with Gantz and Bennett apparently suggesting some sort of alliance. What will that look like, and what is the likelihood of it actually becoming?
We've seen how it's been the left-wing ministers and Knesset members who've been leaving blue and white in recent days. Avi Nissenkorn. Today we had the departure of social equality minister Meirav Cohen, Yizhar Shai, the Minister of Science and Technology, and that has been leading people to think that maybe Benny Gantz will end up running together with Naftali Bennett. I still find it very hard to believe. Benny Gantz is not right-wing, and Naftali Bennett wants to differentiate himself from what he sees as a failing government, and there's no doubt that he blames Benny Gantz for the failures of this government. So it seems to me still like propaganda from other parties that are trying to put both Yamina and Benny Gantz down.
Well, so what is Benny Gantz's future, career in politics? What does that look like? Because right now, as you said, many of his major big-name party partners have left him.
It's not looking very good right now for Benny Gantz. I don't understand why in recent days he's been putting down his potential political partners. Yair Lapid put down on Friday, said that he hates people. He put down Avi Nissenkorn, who's already agreed to be number 2 in Tel Aviv Mayor Ron Huldai's party. He said that he stabbed him in the back and turned the knife. Right now, it really seems like Benny Gantz is burning bridges and making mistakes that will prevent him from getting reelected.
All right. Well, so let's talk now a little bit about some of the other multiple parties that are popping up here. What's the significance of some of these smaller parties, like the new Retirees Party? Are they more lobbyists than anything, or do you expect that they might actually gain some traction over the next couple of months?
Look, you never know what's going to happen in an election. No one thought that the Gil Pensioners Party would make it into the Knesset as it did. And so Danny Atom, the former head of the Mossad, former Labor MK, has decided to make a go at it and try to get support. It's possible that he will take support away from some of the parties currently running, and he'll be an annoyance to them, or maybe he could end up merging with other parties ahead of the February 4th deadline for that as well.
I know there, of course, many other changes, including the Yesh Atid Telem split. What do you think, is leading to that? Why now?
Well, right now, there's all kinds of fighting of parties trying to figure out where and how they are. It's not yet final. Nothing is final. Whether Moshe Ya'alon will end up running separately as he's threatening to do, it's not a very wise move if he does. There are too many parties that are exactly where he is on the political map of being on the right, though opposing Prime Minister Netanyahu. So it could very well be that Lapid is trying to lower the value of Moshe Ya'alon. Everyone's playing the games right now, and on the 4th of February, at least by then, we'll know who's running.
All right, well, as you said, there's a lot more that is going to happen between now and then, and I'd love to have you back to discuss those changes at that time. Until then, thank you so much, Gil.
Pleasure.
In other news, the Middle East is becoming a more complicated powder keg by the day as Iran continues to violate uranium enrichment limits set by the 2015 nuclear deal. And this, while United States President Donald Trump increases military pressures against the regime in Tehran. Hannah Rifkin reporting.
President-elect Joe Biden is just weeks away from taking office, and among his first challenges, an increasingly uncertain and dangerous situation with Iran.
ما خب قبلا 20% رو تولید می‌کردیم و خیلی راحت میتونیم این کار رو انجام بدیم و این کار رو هم خواهیم کرد اگر 4+1 نخواد به تعهدات خودش عمل کنه یا امریکا بخواد شرط‌هایی رو برای برگشتن به برجام انجام بده.
They say that we want to use the leverage that Trump built. So they're basically criticizing Trump verbally, but in practice, they're basically following Trump's policy. And they're making a big mistake. They have an opportunity to correct Trump's mistakes. It doesn't seem like that. It seems that they're following Trump's policies off the cliff.
But while Biden's administration now has a lot to discuss regarding how to proceed, Israel is resolute. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calling out Iran's latest announcement for what it is, a threat.
איראן הודיעה שתעלה את רמת השערת האורניום ותקדם את היכולת התעשייתית להשאיר אורניום מתחת לאדמה. זו הפרה בוטה ומוחלטת של ההתחייבויות שלה. אין לכך שום הסבר אחר פרט למימוש המשך כוונתה של איראן לייצר נשק גרעיני. ואני חוזר ואומר, ישראל לא תאפשר לאיראן לייצר נשק גרעיני.
Similarly, Defense Minister Benny Gantz now calling on the whole international community to join in on the efforts to keep Iran from achieving its military nuclear ambitions.
אני מזכיר לכולנו שאיראן היא אתגר עולמי, אזורי וגם אתגר למדינת ישראל. מערכת הביטחון וכלל הגופים צריכים להמשיך לעקוב אחרי העניין הזה, ואסור לה למדינת ישראל להסכים שאיראן תהפוך לגרעינית ותוכל להתקדם ביתר שאת לכיוון השאיפות שלה. כל העולם צריך להכביד את הלחץ שלו, ואנחנו חייבים להבטיח שלמערכת הביטחון יש את המשאבים הנדרשים על מנת להיות ערוכים להתמודדות עם איראן ככל שידרש בכל הזירות, ואנחנו עובדים בכל הזירות בסך הכל עם שותפים רבים, וצריך להמשיך את המגמה הזאת.
For more, please visit our new and improved website at ILTV.tv and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for daily updates. But joining us now with more is former IDF Foreign Policy and National Security Advisor, Major in the Reserves, Dan Pfefferman. Dan, thank you so much for being with us. Now, what is the current state of affairs between U.S.-Israel coordination on Iran?
Right. Currently, Israel and the Trump administration have very close coordination. We've had close coordination with virtually all the administrations, even though on the top levels it was a little strained during the Obama era. Under Trump, it's been very close coordination, diplomatic, military intelligence, regular exchanges, strategic coordination, and we can assume also on the supposed military strikes attributed to Israel. From the outside, it seems that this administration is a lot more attentive to Israeli concerns and also to Israeli strategic directions, even than previously friendly administrations. We're a lot more in tune, a lot more in sync on this issue. And we're a lot more in sync on the need to use pressure, economic and military pressure, to get Iran back to the table to accept far stricter demands, especially in terms of enrichment, R&D limitations, and then, of course, the use of missiles and the extent of the agreement. So it's not just on the end goal, but also a syncing up on the way to get there between the two administrations.
Do you expect any major changes between the coordination between Israel and the Trump administration and Israel and the Biden administration? Again, Biden is not Obama, but he is from the Obama administration.
Right. So a lot of this depends on whether we get off to a good foot with the Biden administration or not. There are a lot of concerns, and there's still a lot of questions on who's going to be in charge of foreign policy. Once we saw that figures like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, well-known centrists, pro-Israel centrists, not from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but from the more realist foreign policy camp within the Democratic Party, got appointed to the key positions, we can rule out certain approaches. And then the question is, will Biden and his advisors go back to the Obama era approach, which we were opposed to here, and quietly a lot of other U.S. allies were also opposed to this? Or will they take into account regional concerns that Iran itself has made a lot of transgressions of the nuclear deal, of its commitments? We heard about the intent to increase enrichment to 20%, which is the halfway station between where they're allowed to be 3.67% and the 90% needed for military nuclear enrichment. So we have to ensure that we get off to a good start with this administration. We have to work with them in tandem. We have to provide a constructive approach and not just be naysayers. We have to make sure to work with the administration discreetly and earn their trust and not go around them, either to the American public or to Republican members of Congress. And if we can do that, get off to a good start and make sure we have a seat at the table, then I think we can continue to have this close coordination with the new administration.
All right, Dan Pfefferman, thank you so much for your insights.
Pleasure.
Now, in the midst of all the crises in the world, it still seems as though the focus is on Israel, and unfortunately not in the good way. Major media outlets now adopting libelous accusations against Israel with respect to COVID-19. The Jews are to blame for spreading COVID-19. They created fake poisonous vaccines for non-Jews. And now Israel is also to blame for withholding vaccinations from the Palestinians in favor of vaccinating its own citizens. These are just some of the disgusting and baseless rumors being perpetrated by several, sometimes respected Western news outlets. But while the first two accusations may be comical if they weren't so pernicious, the last one leaves a particularly bitter taste in the mouth. Because it's not just being spread by conspiracists in the Twitterverse. It's also now been picked up by the likes of Kenneth Roth, Executive Director for Human Rights Watch, and a number of other officials. What this accusation abhorrently fails to mention, however, is that, of course, Israel has absolutely nothing to do with the Palestinian Authority's health initiatives. As per the Oslo Accords, the PA is fully autonomous when it comes to health and vaccinations. The PA is also already working to obtain the vaccine on its own through the WHO and Russia, having explicitly stated that they do not expect any help from Israel, nor do they want it. And finally, as UN Watch head Hillel Noor points out, this position ironically argues that the PA has enough autonomy to be considered a state, yet lacks the legal power over its own health. Or to put it simply, consider the logic behind accusing Germany of failing to vaccinate the French. Finally, the Israel Antiquities Authority nearly constantly comes out with new discoveries, but the most recently revealed artifacts didn't necessarily come up from the ground below us, rather from an antiquities trafficking network. The IAA announcing that in a joint operation with the police and tax authorities, it's recovered thousands of spectacular and rare items from across 3 warehouses in the Tel Aviv area, along with a number of suspects detained for questioning. And the artifacts, including coins, jewelry, gemstones, pottery, sculptures, and more, date back to up to 2,000 years ago, and they're suspected of being stolen from graves in the Mediterranean basin, South America, and Africa. The head of the IAA Robbery Prevention Unit hailing the operation as one of the most significant in history, and authorities will now be working to determine the origin of these items, along with Interpol and other international bodies. And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be cool and mostly clear with lows around 55 Fahrenheit or 13 degrees Celsius. And then tomorrow you can expect a slight rise in temperatures and partly cloudy skies with an average high of 73 degrees Fahrenheit or 23 Celsius. Now before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Now what you're seeing here might not look super familiar, but it is humpback dolphins, the first time they've ever been sighted off the coast of Israel. This is in Eilat, and we're seeing a mother and a calf. Awesome. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.21 shekels to the American dollar and 2.51 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Then don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and let us know what you think. Just don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.